When the tide of war swept across Southeast Asia in early 1942, few could anticipate the improbable fate of three American bombers destined to become the core of a secretive Japanese experiment. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, an icon still fresh in Allied arsenals, had been mocked by some as lumbering and overengineered. It was rugged, stable, built for high-altitude precision bombing, yet its real legend was about to take shape not over Europe, but in the hands of its adversaries. In the aftermath of fierce combat on the Philippine archipelago, scattered remains of Allied aircraft littered the runways and fields. Among them, under the tropical sun and after weeks of battle, Japanese engineers from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service's Technical Research Institute discovered the near-intact fuselage of a B-17D at Clark Field. Salvaging would become a race against corrosion and obsolescence. The Japanese were determined. This was not just another prize. For them, it represented a rare opportunity to probe the secrets of American engineering and perhaps turn these revelations into their own advantage. Using an array of salvaged parts and the forced labor of captured mechanics, the Japanese managed to piece together a flyable B-17. Not long after, at Matioan Field on Java, fate presented even greater spoils: repairable wrecks of B-17E aircraft abandoned by their Allied crews during the chaotic retreat. It was these models, with their heavier armor, improved defensive firepower, and the celebrated Norden bombsight, that ignited the imaginations of Japanese aviation researchers and test pilots. By mid-1943, the first rebuilt B-17E took to the air, escorted from Singapore to the Japanese home islands by fighters and a Nakajima L-2D transport plane. Fearful of friendly fire, the transfer had to be carefully coordinated. Anti-aircraft batteries along the route received urgent orders not to open fire on the unfamiliar silhouette overhead. As the American bomber circled and landed at Tachikawa Airfield, a hush fell over the technicians and officers assembled to witness the arrival of an enemy marvel. Major Kazuyuki Saito, an aeronautical engineer renowned for his meticulous approach, assembled an elite team for the evaluation. Among them were Lieutenant Shioyama, Lelasars Kurusu, and Ohara, Army Assistant Engineer Shimamura, pilots Major Uno and Captain Yagi, and engine specialist Kaneko. Their mission: dissect every system, study every mechanism, and test the legendary aircraft in flight. The project encompassed exhaustive examination, from engine turbochargers and flight controls to defensive armament and the enigmatic Sperry automatic gunnery computing site. For the Japanese, the B-17 was much more than a bomber. It was an embodiment of American design philosophy. Several admired the aircraft's smooth teamwork between crew stations, the robust airframe built to survive heavy damage, and the advanced fire control equipment that gave its gunners a fighting chance against attacking fighters. Yet there were skeptics too. Mitsubishi engineer Hisanojo Ozawa dismissed the B-17E as merely modifications made to an old design, preferring to focus on the technical systems that could be used to leapfrog Japanese capabilities. Special attention was paid to the Norden bombsight, a closely guarded Allied secret, capable of astonishing accuracy from high altitude, or so Allied propaganda boasted. The Japanese had their own bombsight technology, favoring stabilization methods. They found that by merging certain Norden features with their instrumentation, their bombsight achieved superior performance. The Sperry autopilot system and turbochargers inspired further research, with ambitions to adapt these advances for aircraft like the Kai-83 and Kai-87. Testing proceeded at Fusa Airfield near Tokyo, now the site of the American-run Yokota Air Base. Here, under the cover of secrecy, the B-17E was repeatedly flown, tested, examined, and overhauled. Its engines were run to exhaustion, and intricate studies were made of the cooling systems, propellers, and control surfaces. The defense weaponry, the .50 caliber Brownings, their powered turrets, and the gunnery sights were scrutinized for any tactical lessons. But as Japanese pilots, used to graceful fighters like the Zero or hard-hitting Army bombers, climbed aboard the hulking Flying Fortress, a sobering realization began to set in. In simulated combat exercises and high-altitude test flights, it became clear that intercepting, damaging, or destroying an intact B-17, with its overlapping fields of fire and rugged construction, would be no easy task. Japanese fighters, often lightly armed and designed for agility rather than brute force, struggled in mock attacks against the fortress. The formation tactics of American bomber groups compounded the problem. multiple fortresses could create a box of crossfire, making frontal or rear attacks perilous for even skilled aces. One day in early 1944, tragedy and embarrassment converged at Fusa Airfield. As the B-17E prepared for takeoff during an evaluation flight, a sudden crosswind struck. The pilots, more accustomed to lighter planes, lost directional control. Before reaching full rudder speed, the bomber veered from the runway, smashing its right wing into a parked Nakajima Ki 49. The damage was severe. The Fortress would never fly again. The surviving B-17s continued their clandestine service, visiting bases, standing as teaching aids, sometimes repainted in American colors for propaganda films. For Japanese pilots and engineers, the aircraft's presence was both an opportunity and a source of frustration. They could not copy its scale, and constraints in material and industrial capacity made mass production impossible. Wartime shortages of aluminum, precision instruments, and turbocharged engines torpedoed the hope of an indigenous Japanese flying fortress. Despite their efforts, the Japanese ultimately recognized a dilemma. Even with all technical secrets unveiled, they had limited means of reliably countering Allied heavy bombers. The B-17's high-altitude regime and defensive firepower meant that only the bravest or luckiest attackers could hope to inflict damage, at a deadly cost. Photographic reconnaissance flights by the Allies eventually spotted one of the B-17s at Tachikawa, mistakenly cataloging it as the mysterious Tachikawa 104 because of its immense wingspan. The fact that the bomber was sitting on Japanese soil marked an intelligence coup, but the true story would not be revealed until after the surrender. As the war drew to a close in 1945, records of captured B-17s faded into silence. None remained in post-war inventories or in photographs of Allied occupation troops. The fate of these legendary airframes was lost to history, perhaps scrapped, perhaps destroyed in a hangar fire, or quietly dismantled in the confusion of defeat. Yet the lessons from those Japanese test flights reverberated far beyond their immediate context. Japan's engineers adapted elements of B-17 technology into their own designs, improving bomb sights, fire control systems, and aircraft turbochargers. In the skies, the experience stiffened the resolve of engineers and strategists, reminding them of the daunting challenge posed by Allied four-engine bombers. Above all, the saga of the Japanese-trained B-17s demonstrates a universal truth of warfare and technology. Sometimes, the greatest respect is born from adversity. Humble origins, ridicule, and technical curiosity converged to forge a lasting legend around the Flying Fortress, a symbol of innovation and power that transcended national boundaries. And in the minds of those Japanese aviators, there lingered a singular day of revelation. Confronting the enemy's strength, they found not only the limits of their own knowledge, but a new measure of respect for a machine that would change the course of aerial warfare forever. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, the captured B-17s became a fixture at Japanese airfields, subjects of both fascination and frustration. The technicians who had pieced together these giants from wreckage and salvaged parts now watched them fly in the pale morning light over Mount Fuji, symbols of a technology that seemed tantalizingly close, yet forever out of reach. At Fusa Airfield, now known as Yokota Air Base, the testing intensified. Engineers disassembled the Wright R-1820 Cyclone, engines, measuring tolerances, examining alloy compositions, and analyzing the turbocharger systems that allowed the Fortress to climb to altitudes where Japanese interceptors gasped for oxygen and power. The Americans had mastered the art of high-altitude flight, and the B-17's ability to operate effectively above 25,000 feet represented a realm where Japan's fighters struggled. The defensive armament posed another conundrum. The B-17E models captured by Japan carried a total of 9 to 10 50-caliber Browning machine guns, positioned in carefully overlapping fields of fire. Later models, the B-17G variants that would dominate European skies, bristled with 13 guns, including the revolutionary chin turret designed specifically to counter head-on attacks. Japanese pilots, accustomed to lightly armed bombers with minimal defensive capability, found themselves repeatedly frustrated in mock combat scenarios. Captain Yagi, one of the senior test pilots assigned to the B-17 evaluation program, recalled the unsettling experience of sitting in the cockpit during simulated interception exercises. As friendly Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusa fighters, the nimble Oscar in Allied code, made repeated attack runs, The gunners in the B-17's positions tracked them with ease. The powered turrets, fed by continuous belts of ammunition, could sustain fire far longer than the manually operated positions common in Japanese bombers. More importantly, the Sperry computing site helped correct for deflection, range, and relative motion, giving even moderately trained gunners a fighting chance against experienced pilots. The strategic implications became impossible to ignore. If a single captured B-17, flown by Japanese crews still learning its systems, could present such a formidable challenge to their own fighters, what would happen when dozens or hundreds of these bombers appeared in formation over the home islands? The question haunted the corridors of military planning. Offices in Tokyo, Japanese engineers attempted to extract every possible advantage from their prize. The bomb sight technology, while impressive, was not quite the miracle weapon Allied propaganda suggested. When Imperial Army and Navy ordnance experts examined the Norden bomb site in detail, they found that the stabilization methodology in their own Type 89 and Type 91 bomb sites was actually superior in certain respects. Yet by synthesizing elements from both systems, they created a hybrid instrument that represented a genuine advance over either design. Similarly, the Sperry autopilot system inspired modifications to Japanese flight control systems. The B-17's ability to maintain stable flight with minimal pilot input during long missions was a revelation, particularly for an air force accustomed to aircraft that demanded constant attention from their crews. Engineers at Tachikawa's Research Institute began incorporating similar stabilization concepts into designs for the Mitsubishi Ki-83 twin-engine fighter and the Ki-87 high-altitude interceptor. But these incremental improvements could not mask the fundamental reality. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, material resources, and time necessary to produce anything comparable to the Flying Fortress. The B-17 required massive quantities of high-grade aluminum alloy, precision manufacturing equipment, reliable supercharged engines, and sophisticated electrical and hydraulic systems. By 1943, Japan's economy was already straining under the demands of total war. Critical materials were in desperately short supply, and what industry remained was increasingly vulnerable to submarine interdiction and, eventually, aerial bombardment. Shizuo Kikuhara, the brilliant designer behind the Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, itself considered one of the finest maritime patrol aircraft of the war, studied the B-17 with particular interest. His observations focused on the remarkable simplicity and integration of the cockpit controls. Despite the aircraft's enormous size and complexity, the flight crew operated with a remarkably clean and organized workspace. American engineers had perfected the subsystems to such a degree that the pilot could focus on tactical considerations rather than being overwhelmed by mechanical management. This design philosophy, Kikuhara noted, represented a maturity of aerospace engineering that Japan was still striving to achieve. Yet, not everyone was impressed. Hisanojo Ozawa, a senior engineer at Mitsubishi, dismissed the B-17E as nothing more than modifications applied to an essentially obsolescent design. He argued that Japan should focus on revolutionary concepts rather than trying to match or copy American approaches. His skepticism reflected a broader tension within Japanese aviation circles, between those who saw captured equipment as a source of vital intelligence and those who viewed it as a distraction from indigenous innovation. The three captured fortresses lived parallel lives, serving different purposes as the war intensified. The older B-17D model, already considered obsolete even by American standards, was used primarily for propaganda and training films. Japanese cinematographers carefully staged scenes showing the bomber being inspected, flown, and even shot down by Japanese fighters, footage intended to bolster public morale and demonstrate the supposed superiority of Japanese arms. The two B-17E models, however, remained active in the site evaluation and training program. They visited various bases, including Hamamatsu in June or July 1944, the main Japanese heavy bomber facility. The specific mission remains obscured by lost or destroyed records, but it likely involved comparative testing against Japan's own four-engine bombers, particularly the Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu and the Mitsubishi Ki-67 Hiryu. These comparisons were sobering. While Japanese bombers possessed certain advantages, the Ki-67, for instance, was faster and more maneuverable than the B-17. They could not match the American bomber's altitude performance, defensive firepower, or damage tolerance. Stories had already filtered back to Japan about B-17s returning from missions over Europe with catastrophic damage. Engines shot away, tail sections nearly severed, fuselages riddled with holes. The rugged construction and redundant systems that allowed these bombers to survive and return home had earned them the respect of friend and foe alike. Early in 1944, tragedy struck the evaluation program. One of the B-17E models was preparing for takeoff from Fusa Airfield when a sudden crosswind hit during the initial roll. The pilots, more experienced with lighter aircraft, reacted a fraction too slowly. Before the bomber reached sufficient speed for full rudder authority, it veered off the runway. The massive right wing struck a parked Nakajima Ki-49 heavy bomber with devastating force. Metal shrieked and buckled, fuel sprayed across the tarmac, and the B-17 came to rest at a grotesque angle, its wing crumpled and engines torn from their mounts. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the bomber was finished. It would never fly again. The damaged aircraft was towed to a side area and stripped of any remaining useful components. Eventually, it found a final purpose as a ground-based instructional airframe at the Toyuka Shikan Gakko, Japan's Air Force Academy near Irumagawa Airfield. There, student officers could examine the structure, walk through the interior, and study the systems that had made this bomber so formidable. For these young cadets, many of whom would soon face B-29 superfortresses over their homeland, the hulking wreck served as a silent testament to the scale of the challenge they would confront. By late 1944, American aerial reconnaissance flights were penetrating deeper into Japanese airspace with increasing frequency. High-altitude photo reconnaissance variants of the F-13, based on the B-29 airframe, captured images of Japanese bases with remarkable clarity. In one such mission, a mysterious large aircraft appeared in photographs of Tachikawa Air Base. Intelligence analysts, puzzled by the enormous wingspan, measuring approximately 104 feet, initially coded it Tachikawa 105, assuming it was a new Japanese heavy bomber design. Only after the war, when captured documents and interrogations revealed the truth, did Allied intelligence realize they had been looking at one of their own B-17s. The sighting raised questions and alarms among American planners. If Japan had managed to capture and fly B-17s, what other Allied equipment might they possess? What tactical intelligence might they have gleaned? The psychological impact was notable. The Fortress, designed to project American power into enemy territory, had become a tool for the enemy to study American capabilities. As 1945 dawned, the strategic situation for Japan had become desperate. The island nation faced a tightening noose of blockade, bombardment, and inevitable invasion. American B-29 superfortresses, the B-17's larger, more powerful descendants, were systematically destroying Japanese cities and industries. The captured B-17s, once symbols of technological curiosity and potential advantage, now seemed like relics of a different war. Reconnaissance photos taken in the final months before Japan's surrender showed one B-17 at Irumagawa Airfield, positioned near the Air Force Academy. But 9 days later, when another photo run was conducted, the aircraft had vanished. Its fate, like that of the other captured fortresses, remains a mystery. When Allied occupation forces swept through Japanese airfields in August and September 1945, they found no trace of the American bombers. Historians have speculated endlessly. Were they destroyed in bombing raids, scrapped for desperately needed materials, burned to prevent capture, hidden in remote locations? The answers disappeared with the chaos of defeat. Yet the absence of physical evidence does not diminish the significance of the story. The Japanese evaluation of captured B-17s represented a pivotal moment in the history of aerial warfare, a moment when adversaries came face to face with the reality of technological asymmetry. For Japanese aviators and engineers, the experience was humbling and revelatory. They could touch, measure, fly, and study the Flying Fortress, but they could not replicate it. More troublingly, they realized they had no reliable means of defeating it in combat. The defensive tactics developed during the B-17 evaluation program proved only marginally effective when applied against actual American bomber formations. Japanese pilots learned to favor head-on attacks, closing at tremendous speed to minimize exposure to defensive fire. But such tactics required exceptional skill, iron nerves, and a willingness to accept catastrophic casualties. The introduction of the B-17G model, with its chin turret specifically designed to counter frontal attacks, further diminished the effectiveness of these desperate measures. Some Japanese fighter units resorted to extreme methods, aerial ramming, heavy air-to-air rockets, and even specialized bomber-destroyer variants armed with massive 37mm and 40mm cannons. But these weapons were often unwieldy, reduced fighter performance, and required pilots to close to ranges where the B-17's defensive guns remained lethally effective. The broader lesson transcended tactical considerations. The B-17 Flying Fortress embodied an approach to warfare that integrated industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and strategic vision. It was not merely an aircraft, but a system. Bombers flew in mutually supporting formations, protected by long-range escort fighters, guided by sophisticated navigation and bombing equipment, and sustained by a vast logistical network stretching back across the Pacific and Atlantic. Japan, for all its martial spirit and tactical ingenuity, could not match this comprehensive approach to aerial warfare. In the aftermath of the war, surviving Japanese engineers and pilots spoke with a mixture of admiration and regret about their encounters with the Flying Fortress. Major Kazuyuki Saito, who had led the technical evaluation team, later reflected that the experience had been both enlightening and dispiriting. The B-17 had taught them much about American engineering philosophy, production methods, and combat doctrine, but it had also revealed the enormity of the industrial and technological gap between the United States and Japan, a gap that, by 1943, had become unbridgeable. The legacy of those captured B-17s extended far beyond their brief service in Japanese colors. The technical intelligence gathered during the evaluation program influenced post-war Japanese aviation development. When Japan rebuilt its aerospace industry in the decades after 1945, engineers drew upon lessons learned from studying American aircraft. The emphasis on pilot-friendly controls, system redundancy, and robust construction became hallmarks of Japanese commercial and military aviation. For the United States, the story of the Japanese captured B-17s served as a reminder of both the strengths and vulnerabilities of American equipment. Security procedures for protecting classified technology were tightened, and efforts to deny intact equipment to the enemy became a priority. The Norden bomb site, once considered so sensitive that crews were instructed to destroy it before abandoning aircraft, was eventually acknowledged to be less revolutionary than wartime propaganda had suggested, a realization partly informed by Japanese technical assessments. The Flying Fortress itself evolved and adapted throughout the war. From the early B-17C and D models that proved vulnerable in combat, through the transformative B-17E with its enlarged tail and improved armament, to the definitive B-17G bristling with 13 guns, the aircraft matured into the legend that would dominate historical memory. More than 12,700 B-17s were built by war's end, with 8,680 of them being the ultimate G-model variant. They dropped more bombs on European targets than any other American aircraft, and their crews earned a reputation for courage and determination that endures to this day. The irony is profound. An aircraft initially mocked by some military planners as too expensive, too complex, and too specialized, became one of the defining weapons of the Second World War. Its journey from controversial prototype to celebrated icon mirrors the broader transformation of aerial warfare during the 1940s. And for those Japanese aviators who tested the captured fortresses, who flew them through Japanese skies and confronted the reality of their own limitations, the B-17 represented something more than an enemy weapon. It was a measure of what modern warfare had become, and a harbinger of the technological revolutions that would continue to reshape global conflict in the decades ahead. Today, fewer than 24 airworthy B-17s remain, treasured survivors maintained by museums, historical foundations, and dedicated enthusiasts. They fly at air shows and commemorative events, their massive radial engines rumbling across the sky, a living connection to an era when such aircraft filled the heavens by the thousands. For those who hear them pass overhead, the sound evokes memory, sacrifice, and the terrible beauty of machines built for destruction yet revered for the courage of those who flew them. And somewhere in the fragments of history, in fading photographs and scattered documents, the story of the Japanese captured B-17s endures, a tale of adversaries united by respect for a machine that changed the course of war, and a reminder that technology's true power lies not in the weapons themselves, but in the systems, strategies, and human will that deploy them.